Hello, welcome to Global Eye. I am Parikshit Luthra. With less than 10 days to go for the G20 Leaders Summit, discussions on the communique have entered the final phase. Russian President Vladimir Putin will not be there at the G20, and Chinese President Xi Jinping may not come either. The Chinese side may be represented by Chinese Premier Li Qiang. Remember, Russia and China have together opposed any condemnation of the Ukraine-Russia war, and this is what has been holding back consensus on the communique from the start of India's presidency. So how will the absence of Putin and Xi impact India's G20 summit, and what is the most important agenda for the Indian government? To discuss that and more, we're now joined by Ambassador Rahul Chabbra, former Secretary Economic Relations at the Ministry of External Affairs, and also Ambassador Neelam, former diplomat and director at the Gateway House. Thank you very much for joining us, Ambassador Chabbra and Ambassador Deo. Ambassador Chabbra, let me begin by asking you, how do you think the absence of Putin and Xi will impact working of the G20 Leaders Summit, the consensus across different sessions?
Good evening, Parikshit. Thank you for having me on your show. Firstly, the absence will sort of affect the optics. It's not really going to affect the consensus, because the consensus building has been in position for the last several months, and we have sort of reached a consensus on virtually every aspect except the aspect that you mentioned. So except for that, there has been forward movement, progress and consensus achieved thanks to our efforts. The presence of the two leaders would have helped in terms of, firstly, the bilaterals. There would have been very important bilaterals with several countries. And, of course, the sort of camaraderie, the bonhomie, the personal chemistry, that's all built up during the retreat, the informal interactions, the pull-asides that happen during summits like this. But otherwise, the hard work, the grunt work of building up the consensus is sort of already being done in the background. It's virtually reached its final stages by diplomats and ministers that have been working over the last several months. And of course, we will get a chair summary, or we'll get an outcome document. We will not get a joint communique.
Okay, we might not get a communique, we will get a chair summary for that matter, as we've seen with different meetings over the last few weeks. But Ambassador Deo, if I can come to you, we've got a statement from Sergei Lavrov. He has said to the Russian media that there will be no general declaration on behalf of all members if the Russian position is not reflected. Basically, Russia has said that they will block the declaration if their view is not taken forward. How do you see this statement, and what kind of a role can Russia play?
Well, I think it's quite clear he's making a statement about what has been happening throughout. We haven't had joint statements from the finance ministers or from the when the foreign ministers met. So basically, that's all that I would read into the statement. So there won't be a joint communique, but there will be the chairman's statement, and there will be all the important paragraphs reflecting agreements on all the issues that have been discussed for the past almost 1 year now, including such things as on finance, for instance, where we didn't have a joint statement, and the Russian and Chinese position is well known. I don't think there is much for them to reiterate at this point. So for the two presidents to stay away, it's a pity, and as my colleague says, there would have been important bilateral meetings for the Indian side, but also from their side with other heads of government. But perhaps they decided that they would have faced too much criticism to want to take it in their face, so to speak.
Right. Ambassador Chabbra, returning to you, when it comes to the role of China, and Kristalina Georgieva, the IMF chief, had earlier said that China has to be on the table when it comes to crucial decisions impacting the global economy, including debt restructuring, multilateral development bank reform as well for the future. When Xi Jinping is not there, yes, most of the groundwork on the communique, on the declaration or the chair summary, that's already been done. But Do you think that China could throw a spanner in the works when it comes to a common framework on debt restructuring or, for that matter, on multilateral development bank reform or climate financing?
The fact that he's there or not there is really not the issue, because delegations, when they debate, and these things happen all in the background, they happen prior to the leaders' meeting. So when a leaders' meeting actually take place, they aren't actually sorting out issues like this face to face. And when the delegations are there, they're getting the instructions, the guidance from the leaders. So the leaders are fully in the picture of how things are moving. So if this was not going to take place or things were not going to evolve, it's not because he's not there. So that's just to make one procedural sort of point clear. Otherwise, I think there has been sort of forward movement in the issues you've mentioned. It may not have moved enough. The needle has not probably moved enough in terms of climate financing, multilateral debt funding. But there has been movement on all these fronts. So we just wait and see how much exactly when we get out the final chair's summary when it comes out.
Right. What would you be looking out for, Ambassador Deo? We will see at least 23 or 25 heads of state, heads of government there at the G20 from 8th to the 10th. What kind of atmosphere are we likely to see in the room? Do you expect the G7 to have its own meeting as well, Ambassador Deo?
Yeah, I think that in most of these meetings now, the small groupings do have their own consultations and meetings. So yes, likely the G7 will have a separate meeting, since all their heads of government are going to be here. That will be quite important. But I think that is what happens in every G20 for the past couple of years. You know, in some ways, I think maybe, there are areas where the Chinese cannot obstruct. For instance, IMF restructuring. China is a very important voice, but it's still less than 6% of the vote. So if there is a restructuring agreed to by the other members of the IMF or the World Bank, that can proceed whether or not China and even Russia agree to it. So I don't think that the big concern for China and Russia is on these kinds of issues of climate change or financial or digital public infrastructures. Their concern is that, and they have been saying it repeatedly, that this is not the forum for political issues. That is, in a way, infructuous now. There isn't going to be an agreed communique. There will be a chairman's statement, and more, in the chairman's statement also, it is clarified that some delegations did not agree to this wording or agree to that wording.
Right. All right. Ambassador Chabbra, returning to you, when it comes to India's key priorities, what is the one big thing that India would like to achieve in those 3 days, 8th, 9th and 10th, 9th and 10th being the substantive days?
If I may be permitted to just go back for a split second to continue on Ambassador Deo's point, China generally does not like to be the last man standing. So that is their general position. So if there is consensus building up, they are not the ones who will sort of stand in the way in that sense. But coming to the question that you just raised, India's concern has always been in this summit to put across the one world, one earth, one family, that concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And in that context, the sub-theme has been to sort of play as the voice of the global south. So you remember that Prime Minister Modi had this summit where over 125 countries participated, though it was a virtual summit. And then even at the BRICS meeting, he had meetings with several bilateral meetings with many of the African countries, the other Asian countries who were present. So he got a good feel of what the global south wants, what is our desires. That is basically food, security, fuel, fertilizers, climate finance, circular economy, sustainable development. So India has been putting all these issues on the table, which has not been really done ever by the G20 before. And more than that, rather than just putting the issues on the table, they've also been putting out solutions to these. For example, in terms of food security, the International Year of Millets. So millets is a very, consumes less water and is much more nutritional. In terms of climate change, the solar initiatives that you've taken. In terms of climate financing, the different types of options that are available, carbon taxes, green bonds, catastrophe bonds, public-private partnerships. So you've got to be able to raise money, raise funding on all these ways, but also raising awareness, continue to raise awareness in the COP about what the developed world has committed and has not delivered yet, the $100 billion annual commitment that they have done for climate change.
Right. Ambassador, my final question to you. Ukraine wanted President Zelensky to participate in G20. There were representations from the Ukraine government to have Zelensky be invited. India said that the list of invitations has already gone. It's all done with. We did not invite Zelensky. But do you think the G7, when it meets at their own level, could consider some sort of intervention, some sort of representation from Zelensky, from Ukraine, at least at the G7 level, to show solidarity?
The G7 has gone out of its way to commit itself to Ukraine. So I think they may do anything. I mean, all G7, European Union, NATO, all of these meetings now begin with declarations of undying fealty to Zelensky of Ukraine. I hope they won't do something that is disruptive and that takes away attention from all the things that have been agreed to and all the things that are actually in many ways more important, not only to the global south. For example, India has suggested that we invite the African Union to join the G20, the way the European Union is represented or the IMF, etc., are all participating. I think that's really important, given the fact that right now, Africa is top of the agenda for the United States, for China, certainly for India. It's been important for a while. So I do hope that the G7 will not do something to embarrass the host. And actually, I don't think they will. But could they? Yes, but they could only invite to one of their own gatherings, which they have been doing ceaselessly for the last year and a half.
Right. All right. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. And I'd like to thank Ambassador Chabbra as well for joining us on this very interesting discussion, looking ahead to that mega G20 meeting that will take place in the national capital. Over 10,000 delegates expected, a huge challenge in terms of protocol, security and logistics for the Indian government. But they tell us they are prepared, 99%. We're going to take a short break on that note, but when we return, we will get you a conversation with Harsh Vardhan Shringla, the Chief Coordinator for India's G20 presidency, on the state of preparations, what to expect and India's core priorities. The upcoming G20 Summit in New Delhi, apart from driving a consensus on issues of global importance, will also give India a chance to showcase its cultural heritage and diversity. Cultural events, retreat for spouses of G20 leaders are on the cards as well. I spoke with G20's Chief Coordinator Harsh Vardhan Shringla earlier today. He told me the preparation for the summit began long ago with extreme attention to detail for an event of this scale. We also talked about India's key agenda, the preparation and consensus on the communique. Here's that conversation.
Could you give us a sense as to how many foreign visitors are actually going to come to Delhi between the 7th and 10th of September?
Well, it's, in terms of a very rough ballpark figure, we could expect anything from between, I would say, 8 to 10,000 people coming in during this period. It could be more, it could be slightly less, but very roughly we would have a very large influx of our foreign guests who would be coming in for the summit. They're not just the leaders and the delegations, there's also the international media. There is a very large support group that comes in with every head of state and government. And I think we have certainly factored in all of these different components of visitors who would come into our country, made sure that the reception they receive, the welcome they receive, the exposure that they would have in the short time that they would spend in our country would be appropriate and would be very, very sound. And we intend to fully live up to the Prime Minister's vision of an impeccable and uniquely Indian Presidency and G20 Summit.
One thing that immediately comes to one's mind when you speak about 10,000 foreign visitors, heads of state, VVIPs, foreign ministers, finance ministers, is where are you going to put them up, Ambassador Shringla? Limited number of five-star hotel capacity in the capital. So how are you making room for these large delegations?
I think provision was made well in advance, and there's obviously every delegation has made their bookings into a hotel of their choice. You may not fit all delegations within Delhi. You might have to go to other parts of the NCR, but I think all delegations have been satisfactorily booked, and I think the experience wherever you are in our national capital region will be a great one.
In terms of the experience we want to give them, could you give us a sense of the cultural experience, the cuisine experience that we're going to give the leaders? There's been a lot of focus on showcasing the one district, one product scheme. So when the leaders are heading back to their respective countries, are they going to be given specific products or any kind of special mementos that have been thought about as well?
So I think on a very broad level, every G20 meeting has been an opportunity for us to showcase not only our developmental achievements, but also our rich cultural heritage and diversity, our tourism potential. And undoubtedly, the summit will present the highest opportunity to do so. So whether it's your technological prowess, whether it is your, as you mentioned, your unique products in terms of your, handicrafts, in terms of your cultural artifacts, I'm sure there would be ample opportunity to present these in more than one way.
Right. Now, speaking about India's core agenda, to what extent do you believe the Ukraine-Russia war could impact our agenda going forward? There have been previous meetings where we could not find consensus on the communique because of the differences on the war. Is there any sign that those differences may be on the back burner and we may find a communique?
So, to be honest, I'm not the right person to answer that question for the simple reason that I don't deal with that on a regular basis. But you have had interviews with others, and I'm sure they can give you a better sense of where that is. The important thing is, I think the deliberations so far have been very, very substantive. All of our G20 partners have contributed very actively towards, I would say, having outcomes that can impact, as I said, positively on the rest of the world. They have understood our philosophy of using the G20 platform, whether it's a developed country or an emerging economy, to use the G20 platform for the global common good, and our concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one future, to promote a new global world, a new global order through international collaborations and cooperation.
Right, but are you trying to make sure that the Ukraine-Russia war does not somehow derail the larger conversation at the summit?
What we are saying is that in today's context, you have a fairly troubled global order. I mean, you've had, one of the worst, most difficult crises in the form of the global, COVID-19 pandemic. You have an ongoing Ukraine conflict. All of these have had an impact, adverse impact on global growth and development. They've set back the SDG process. They've impacted adversely on your efforts towards climate change. And it's the developing world, the global south that has borne the brunt of this, whether it is through, if you can see it in the form of indebtedness that a very large number of middle and low income countries are facing, whether it is in the form of their having to deal with exponential increase in the prices of essential imports, whether it is fuel, food, fertilizers. So the impact on the developing world has been very significant. And so the G20 as a group has a certain responsibility to be able to contribute in terms of macroeconomic and financial stability, but also in terms of the real needs of the Global South. And I think when we engage the Global South with the Voice of Global South Summit that we held well before our presidency began, many of those views and concerns and expectations of our G20 presidency were articulated by our partners in the Global South, and those have been more than amply, I think, internalized in the G20 process under our presidency. So if you look at our broad priorities, we have reflected the priorities of the Global South and the rest of the world. So when we are chairing the G20, and it is a unique opportunity, we don't speak just for ourselves or our G20 partners, we speak for the entire world. And so the changes that we're trying to bring about through the G20 process should impact the world. So when you look at one Earth, one family, one future, we're saying that what can we do to make it a better global order? Can we not create a new order, new global order that is based more on global collaborations than conflict?
Right.
One that can address many of the issues that countries face today.
Yeah.
And the G20 is the best platform to be able to provide that redressal.
Okay. Now, coming to the issue of our core agenda, give us a sense of our priorities, the Prime Minister's priorities during those 3 days.
So, as I said, I mean, our effort will be to look at not only issues that are important to the G20, but the rest of the world. From that point of view, we are looking at what can we do to provide momentum to the SDG process. Sustainable development goals are important for the world, but especially important for the Global South, because socioeconomic development is critical in terms of growth indices. Already in the halfway point to the SDG process, we have seen it faltering as a result of some of the extraneous developments that have nothing to do with the Global South. We are also looking at how we can use or we can foster digital transformations through digital public infrastructure. How can we use our experience and our expertise in promoting greater inclusivity and enabling states to empower their own people? The Prime Minister pointed out that there are 3 billion people in the world who don't have access to identity cards. There are 1 billion people without bank accounts. How can we use digital technology to provide solutions to some of these problems? We are also looking at environmental issues. Climate change, for example, has been greatly affected by the recent crises. How can we promote our philosophy of lifestyle for sustainable development and the environment to bring about a pro-planet movement? Right. So every individual does his part to alleviating that inexorable move towards global warming. It is not enough to initiate climate actions alone.
Yeah.
What can we do to foster a circular economy, a blue economy? And from that point of view also, how can we work with the multilateral development banks to strengthen their mandate, not only to address the issues of indebtedness and the demands on their own ability to provide relief to developing countries, but also in terms of providing climate financing. How can you support these countries in the transition towards a greener, cleaner future? Indebtedness really narrows the fiscal space that is important for investments in the SDG sector. You have to support that process, otherwise that entire process of climate change and environmental actions would be affected. Women-led development, how can you empower women? And how can you foster growth on a global basis?
You've mentioned all our priorities, but areas where we will definitely see consensus, substantive outcomes that will emerge that Brazil and the G20 will be able to build on going forward. The 3 top areas where we have consensus.
So we have taken a number of initiatives that are unique. I mean, if you look at the fact that we have introduced for the first time a disaster reduction relief group, a DRR working group, I think that is very important from the point of view of many countries across the world. We have introduced a Startup 20, which is again critical for technology and technological development mainly fostered through the youth. We have also introduced for the first time, or rather got the G20 to deliberate on cybersecurity and issues that are again new to the process. We have also looked at how we can provide global governance for new and emerging technologies, whether it's responsible artificial intelligence, whether it is cryptocurrencies. How can we create an international governing structure that all countries can be a part of and adhere to? So these are the initiatives that are important, and ones that I think would not only leave our imprint on the G20 process, but would go on, as you said, to Brazil and South Africa, and that process would continue. So our narrative on the global agenda, which is whether it is through our philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, human-centric globalization, whether it is Maharishi working on billets and other ancient grains, which is lifestyle for environment, which is on the environmental sector, these are the priorities that we see.
Ambassador Shringla, thank you very much for speaking to CNBC TV18 about
Absolute pleasure.
G20 priorities and what we can expect on the 9th and 10th of September.
All right, that was Harsh Vardhan Shringla, the chief coordinator for India's G20 presidency. But the discussions on the declaration, the chair summary, they're all in the final stage. So it will be a lot of news next week, and keep tuning in to CNBC TV18 for the latest updates on the G20 Leaders Summit. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.